Jack, play. Milos.
High speaking first, no preference, and Doi speaking second, no preference.
Thank you all very much. I welcome the Prime Minister. Thank you very
Panel, we think that communities that have suffered from great atrocities need an explanation for these acts. We think that they effectively have two choices. One, where they portray the individual perpetrators as specifically evil individuals who did it out of evilness, or the alternative of coming up with other circumstantial explanations for their behavior that don't stem from their evil personality. We claim the second explanation is the better one. Why? Because we think that the priority of these communities is to seek for long-term standing social change and long-term standing peace inside their community and inside their country, and that's why we think that effectively you must propose. We think that, one clarification, that this doesn't necessarily concern the most evil or special leaders of these kind of atrocities. So we don't think this is necessarily a motion of how we should portray the acts of great evil leaders, but rather how they portray the individuals as per the motion talk and emphasize talking about the majority of people. Therefore, four things in this speech. One, why this is the way, how the vast majority of evil acts are actually taking place and why that matters. Two, how this allows social critique much better. Third, how this shapes the kind of reaction that you get from the side of the perpetrator. And four, why this is a better explanation for your own community. Let's talk about why this actually is something, why this is the real way how things happen. Firstly, I think it's very important for a couple of reasons I'm going to explain much later why the explanation you have in your community is the real one. But the reason why this is the real way how most atrocities happen is because the most evil things that take place are rarely things that only individual one person can themselves do. At least there are a number of individuals who are complicit in those actions that are taking place. We think that comes often in the form of following orders and doing what you have been told, where you have a genuine alternative of doing something else. Yes, please.
So why do some crimes under the status quo not require a motive?
I'm not sure why this is necessarily something that we need to discuss. Explain yourself later and we'll respond. Okay, fine. So firstly, we think that at the point at which you need to follow orders, it's very, very unrealistic to assume that you are somebody who has actively been evil. We also think that often in circumstances where great evil acts, genocide or whatever, are committed, what happens is that you have a circumstance where you effectively have to choose whether you're with us or whether you are outside of the group and also, therefore, a victim. We think it's incredibly hard, for example, in things like Hutu, Tutsi conflict and so forth, for people to effectively opt out of the atrocities that take place. We think that means that in the vast majority of scenarios, the vast majority of people who are at least complicit in these acts and therefore have to be somehow discussed within these communities that where the victims are likely to have not been evil, but rather have been bystanders who for their own personal benefit were there. No, thank you. Okay. Why does this then...
Why?
Yes, please.
Yeah, when the Hutu people draw their machetes and kill people in the streets of their own village, what do you think that the orders for them were and who gave them?
So, I don't know what their orders were. I do know that they probably had been kind of encouraged by their leaders to do this. I think that there were individuals who at least prohibited them from doing these actions, and I further think that it's very unlikely that such a number of people would have been specifically evil. I also don't know whether it's very important were they actually specifically evil. I think what actually matters more is the fact that the perception that those individuals who hold power is that they were not evil. Okay, moving on. Why is this especially important for the social critique in this motion? We think that the vast majority of atrocities that take place are probably due to lack of checks and balances on behalf part of those individuals who were in power. We think that is especially true when we talk about lesser atrocities that happen within like semi-functioning systems and democracies. We think that things like police brutality, things like effectively terrorist attacks and so forth on minority communities in US and so forth are likely to be things that can be changed by the fact that you implement more checks and balances. We think crucially, if your social narrative is within your community, that these acts were acts of specific individuals who were specifically evil, your criticism and your community will never focus on the fact that you have to change the very system how you function in your country. You never focus in your social campaigns on the fact that you have to build more of these checks and balances to avoid these issues in the future. Rather, you focus on mocking these specific individuals. We think you have that mechanism not getting long-lasting change. Let's talk about the reaction of the perpetrators, and I think this also explains to a high degree why it's incredibly important that we have a realistic narrative, right? Because we think that in the communities where these people live, the ones who committed these atrocities very often hold the social and political capital. It's already evident by the fact that they were able to commit these atrocities, and probably to a high degree, they still are having this power. We think it is very, very hard for those communities naturally who committed these atrocities to accept that they are specifically evil individuals. And for as long as we hold the narrative that they are specifically evil individuals, it's incredibly hard for us to build any long-lasting peace between these communities. Two reasons why it's very hard for you to accept them that they are very evil. One, because it's against the reality, as I told you. Two, because even if it's not, the people who committed these atrocities and genocides and so forth are often your family members, people from your class, people from your workplace and so forth. It's very hard for you to believe that somebody that you have been around with for a long time is a especially evil individual. I think that at the point at which the claim is that they are specifically evil individuals, the reaction of the people who committed the atrocities is to defend this individual. It is to say that no, nothing happened, or that if it happened, it was reasonable and they are not evil. I think we get much more concessions and much more of reasonable discussion from this at the point at which we have a narrative that both sides can to some degree accept. A narrative in which we don't portray the perpetrator as inherently evil individual. We think that matters because they have the social and political capital to give things like memorials, to give things like funds for the families whose family members have been killed, to change the policy and so forth. We think it also matters because it gives more ground for the minority that has been attacked to shape the social narrative around this issue. Because we think that in vast majority of scenarios, countries post-conflict don't necessarily speak about that conflict in things like school curriculum and so forth. At the point at which when you don't antagonize the controlling majority with your understanding of the situation, you're more likely to be able to have some kind of say and some kind of ability to shape what has actually happened. We think that means effectively things like we actually talk about this issue now in school, given that we've been able to come to a little bit more of a consensus on what has happened. We are more likely to be able to just control the details of what this narrative looks like at the point at which when we don't claim that the people who are actually shaping the narrative are all inherently evil. Lastly, why is this a better explanation inside of our community? We think that at the point at which your community also understands that there was a huge number of perpetrators who often claim that they were bystanders or that they were actively not knowing what was happening or whatever, we think that it's very hard for you to yourself also believe that 50% of the population in your country were actively evil. We think that it's incredible that you are left with a question inside of you of why did this happen on me, what is going on, and am I safe in future? We think you are much more likely to feel that you are safe in future when you have a path of knowing that by having social critique on the mechanism and on the circumstances and on the system and by implementing checks and balances there can be change, rather than in circumstances where you're afraid of the vast majority of the people being evil and against you. Vote OG.
Panel, Hannah Arendt termed the banality of evil in response to Nazi Germany a unique state in the apparatus that it was able to harness for its evil aims. We are going to give a correct characterization of the circumstances under which these acts take place in the 21st century going forward, before showing you why this is crucial to the very state resolve and building that opening government wanted to claim on their side of the house. 4 points are responsive to all 4 arguments in opening government. Firstly, this gets the majority of evil. This is going to be directly clashed with my comparison, but also I think that opening government failed to acknowledge that yes, individuals can't commit genocide, but they can commit the individual murders that are the composite elements of the genocide. Secondly, on why you get social critique, I'm going to directly respond to this by showing you why only when breaking the information monopoly that happens under these atrocities do you get the kind of tailored mechanisms going forward in new states. Thirdly, in terms of the perpetrator reaction and the reaction of communities sympathetic to them, I don't care, because at the point in which you are trialing people, at the point in which the banality of evil is a relevant concept, that is the point at which external pressure on the perpetrator is enough that the family of the perpetrator is quite an irrelevant consideration in whether you get any accountability. Fourthly, in terms of own identity and how you shape social critiques going forwards, look, I think realistically it is very difficult to go to a school and be like, you should not be evil in the future, but you probably won't know when you're being evil because only the people at the top know it. I think we're going to show you why you get the structural change that opening government claim that they want. Firstly, why this is an inaccurate characterization of evil in the 21st century. Look, this only applies to complex structures. Hannah Arendt replied to the comment done in Nazi Germany that I just made the trains run on time. Probably the last time this has been relevant is Cambodia. Why is this? It requires, firstly, a highly specialized, segmented institutional structure. That means that parts of the structure do not know what is going on in the whole. I think you need large enough structures and complex enough structures to segment that information. But secondly, you need no access to external media and total control of internal media. That is to say that the reason that this happened in Nazi Germany and Cambodia is that they didn't have the internet and telephones, and they were able to shut out any external reporters. I think going forward, it is highly unlikely that people cannot access any external news or any non-state apparatus news in now the status quo. So I think this is probably in developed nations, which are not the kind of nations they wanted to talk about when they're dropping names like Rwanda. And even then it's quite difficult that's going to happen because of the technology I talk about. So this happens in two types of communities. The first are less developed states, right? That is the Uganda, Rwanda, and Sudan, late 90s, early 2000s conflicts. And the second, and crucially, OG never wanted to acknowledge these actors exist, are non-state decentralized actors. ISIL, the Lord's Resistance Army. These actors are now in power because of information technology and also the growing number of international accountability mechanisms for states designed to respond to the banality of evil. That is, we have a greater chance of theirs taking place under those actors. So, two problems. Firstly, we raise the burden of proof in convicting people who have perpetrated these crimes potentially. And secondly, based on that raising of the burden of proof, the impacts this has not just on accountability, but also on post-conflict states going forwards. Look, I'm going to say that firstly, given the nature of these organizations, the fact that the institutional structure has probably fallen at the point where you have an accountability mechanism, but secondly, because of all these structural reasons why this happens in less developed and decentralized states, there is very little information in the system when you are trialing these actors. That means it is already incredibly hard to convict them under their motives under the status quo. Obviously, when you then start with a narrative that they are not evil, this raises the burden of proof with evidence that is not in existence to challenge that status quo. That has two problems. Firstly, you have a lower chance of accountability of actors who have done this. And we don't care if maybe we get some people who are accused or convicted of these problems, even when they are not, precisely because in the kind of states where this happens, it is not necessarily going to jail that is the penalty. See Rwanda mandatory community service for those that participated in the Tutsi genocide. But secondly, you have a lower chance of pressure of a conviction, which is exactly the kind of mechanism you need to force people to rat out other actors, which breaks the information monopoly under the status quo. Obviously, that means you get lower convictions and accountability and lower information. This is important because under both sides of the house, families have lost their fathers, sons, daughters, and mothers. What makes the difference is ending the torture of not knowing what happened to them. We bring you that uniquely in opening opposition. We also think that necessarily ends impunity. And even if you don't get a trial on both sides of the house of everyone that did it, we think there is at least some rebound to impunity at the point where you were able to at least get some information out in the open that someone might have been responsible for these crimes closing.
Yeah, this depends on being able to punish a lot of bureaucrats who aren't the target of these investigations anyway, in societies where there's already very little evidence. This seems very symmetric.
Jesus, Trenton, were you not listening? There are not bureaucrats in the Lord's Resistance Army or in the Rwandan genocide because the state apparatus tends to be relatively small, and these are non-state actors that take place and are convinced to go through this with narratives. You were ignoring when I told you that the very kind of structures where the banality of evil takes place are those that are bureaucratic, which are those that are probably not in this debate in the 21st century. I gave you structural mechanisms why that is the case. But it's not just that we need to know who committed these crimes because we want to send them to prison or find out what happens to loved ones. That is, we need to understand the motivations and narratives that caused these atrocities in the first place. Opening government was naive and unstrategic to mention Rwanda, because it is exactly in the accountability mechanisms of the Gakaka grassroots courts, where you do not have the banality of evil narrative and start with the point that evil was the motivating factor, that we are able to find out the motivations for these problems and build a post-transitional state that works going forwards. I would posit that things like racial quotas and things like racial harmony education, things like cross-cultural and cross-linguistic collaboration, are the very acts that take place as soon as you identify that kind of ghettoization, segmentation, and other prevailing narratives were what caused these atrocities in the first place. Because I think if you actually listen to what the Hutu said on the radio, it was kill the Tutsis, they are not one of us. Which shows you why the impetus for integration and harmonization only occurs when you understand that. But also you simply build in safeguards to make sure that this never happens again. In Rwanda, you do not have your ethnic subgroup on your ID card because they were aware that the narrative that prevailed allowed people to segment the population by their ethnicity and kill them accordingly. You build in these safeguards within the state infrastructure and mechanism to make sure this never happens again. I am proud to stand in opening opposition.
That speaker very much about the GPS.
Stream, right? Ready? The petition says, collaboration occurs when you recognize what systemically causes atrocities to be committed by people. They also say, we don't care about how the majority perceives how these victim groups react. That is their failure. That is why they prove nothing. Because they assume that collaboration magically happens, even when no one believes you. Even when actually, as Jon has already explained, people now have systemically incentives to explain why it wasn't that bad. Why actually people were not evil. Like, we think fundamentally, one of the reasons we think this motion should stand is that we think the banality of evil is simply true, and it's easier to convince people of that. But furthermore, a lot of responses and further analysis on why this breeds anger and resentment and why that is specifically bad and prevents you moving forward. Firstly, like on holding leaders accountable, and just to super clarify this. Firstly, note that the banality of evil does not say it's exclusively only committed by ordinary people, only that in a majority of cases. And note, for example, when Elo says, like, people, like, individuals still commit the murders, etc. Like, Yes, but also note that there's no reason we can't hold those individuals accountable. Furthermore, we think most atrocities are not actually when you're being killed. It's the people who put you on the trains. It's the people who like guard those prisons where you're taken. It's the people who like take part in those structures in like relatively ordinary roles. It's police officers that come to find you and so on, who are not in fact committing murders and like where this thing doesn't apply. Furthermore, secondly, note that this narrative basically blames the system and assigns most responsibility to the people who are responsible for having designed that system. This is, for example, political parties, for example, like leaders of countries and so on. And also note, to the degree that opposition, like we are obviously assigning a certain degree of responsibility on either side of the house for these atrocities. To the degree that opposition is shifting that towards individuals who have committed individual murders, etc., they are also shifting it away from the leaders, because they are saying these individuals who participated in that system were evil, were racist, instead of saying that this leader made these people do these things. This system like turned people to racists bit by bit, like eating every part of your humanity day by day. We would prefer that to be the narrative, also because we think the leaders are realistically the most accountable and also the ones we should hold accountable. And also note who we have most power to change by not, for example, electing similar people in the future, by being able to critique people when they turn to similar narratives and say this is exactly what was happening at the time, so that we can be critical of them and make sure this never happens again. Secondly, they say we don't care about the reactions of the majority, like we should just prosecute them, etc. Firstly, no, this is contingent on prosecutions occurring in the first place. We think this is not the case in a lot of atrocities, or there are systemic reasons why those prosecutions tend to fail, for example, due to the state apparatus being powerful, or due to lack of evidence, or similar factors. Secondly, it is unclear how this motion changes the burden of proof in trials, just because we between us as victims interpret it in a certain way. The legal standards in international courts and like war crime tribunals would seem to be equivalent under either case, so we are not sure how this changes. Thirdly, this ignores the fact that atrocities, as Jonas explained, systemically happen to minorities and vulnerable groups. If you have a lot of power, you have a lot of people, you have tanks and airplanes, you are less likely to be subjected to atrocities in the first place, because you have the power to defend yourself from those atrocities being visited upon you. That is why, also you need to note that you need the majority's goodwill in the future to continue living in that state in a peaceful way. You need a majority's cooperation to make sure that that genocide is taught to the next generation, that they knew that you went through, that those people can sympathize, that people simply know, instead of denying that from you. No, this is not something that is automatic like LO assumes. Know that Japan to this day denies comfort women. Know that Japan to this day denies what happened in Nanking. This is something that can happen when you do not emphasize the banality of evil, and happens systemically more. Fourthly, they say you need information. To the degree this is true, OO's logic actively undermines this. If the most important thing is knowing what happened to my father, then giving individuals more incentives to deny their culpability and not being sympathetic to them makes them more likely to destroy evidence, because they are more likely to feel targeted. Individuals destroying evidence of others, etc., because they want their ethnic group or similar to be perceived as not culpable. Then they say that we're irrelevant because people can shut up external news. Note a lot of atrocities have happened in relatively modern times. See Balkans in the 90s, etc., when similar things already existed to some degree. Note China with Uyghurs, like Rohingya in Myanmar. We think there is a lack of media access in many cases. Note most of the atrocities happen either in war or in very authoritarian states. In both cases, you actually have very limited access to media, but furthermore, even if you have access to media, for example, that is maybe not in your language, a thing which is bad for access, which means you literally cannot comprehend that information. The state can shut out this, but also note that these things usually do not happen overnight. Today, we are fine with the minorities, and tomorrow we start killing them at 9 a.m. That is not how it happens. It happens over time, where bit by bit these are taken away. It undermines your ability to be critical, especially when that comes from people in power, and each single step seems acceptable. However, systemically, this turns you to atrocities. Also, you trust them. Theo.
Yeah, when in Israel in general compared some aspects of the Israeli state to 1930s Nazi Germany, he was fired. But when an Israeli politician claims Arabs should be transferred by force, he was compared to Nazis and was forced out of the Israeli parliament. Why do you think this is the case?
Can you repeat that, sorry?
Yeah, I say that criticizing the state is much less effective than criticizing specific people in states generally.
So the thing is, like, we think we can criticize the specific leaders still, and not these. Note also Israel is a specific case because most minorities that have atrocities visited upon them do not get a new state where they are the majority. So we think also like most of these cases take place in situations where you're staying in your current state and the majority is likely being held. Anger is really good in the short term, right? But it is really bad and leads you away from the inside in the long term. When like you are hurt, sad, and aggrieved, but you are not as angry, and you do not see the other group as monsters by default, and you do not display that in interactions with the other group, you are more likely to have people listen to you, be sympathetic, and recognize atrocities. Note, if you do not regulate and interpret this within your community, one, you easily have an echo chamber that breeds resentment and anger. You see, it's understandably hard for you to understand how anyone could do that to you. But secondly, you have less containment of the most angry, extreme, and radical people within your community, who are the ones who the majority will focus on when they are being denialist, when you seem unreasonable. We think at the end of the day, we need things in the future, like we need recognition of atrocities. We need concessions, and the only way you can get concessions is by having people believe you. For those reasons, incredibly proud to propose.
I thank that speaker very much and welcome you, Diana.
Panel, the reason that Japanese presidents still to this day visit the Yakasoni war shrine is because war criminals were just soldiers, because they were just taking orders. This is the reality of what the banality of evil means for these states. It means you never identify the problem, you never accept that you were wrong, and you continue to believe that what they did just happened and it wasn't their fault. Compare that then to Rwanda, that recognises that Tutsis, saying that Tutsis were scum and actively going down streets and shooting every woman and child that they found was horrific. That's the reason you no longer have your race on your identity card within Rwanda, and you see significantly greater cohesion and recognition of wrong as compared to Japan. That is the reality of the situation that opening government refuses to engage in and refuses to accept is a problem under their side of the house. 2 points in my speech. Firstly, why the banality of evil is not applicable in the sort of cases that they want it to and why that matters. And secondly, why the only way you're likely to get communities to progress, to move past what happened in the past, but also to prevent it happening again, is to accept that there is some wrong and the banality of evil is not correct. Let's first deal with why this theory is often not applicable and doesn't exist in the way that opening government tells you it is. Because Oscar gave you complex reasons why it is the case that in a lot of current states, or non-state actors we're talking about, the banality of evil could never apply. That's things like they don't have complex structures which pass orders down, which means that individuals at the bottom have no idea what's going on. The Hutus of Rwanda were really, really clear that they were actually going out to try and eliminate the entire Tutsi race. I don't know how government is ever going to convince you that they were not aware that they were doing this. Secondly, though, we tell you that it requires a control of media in order to convince that banality of evil could ever exist. That's because, for example, when you have ISIS fighters who actively go out and kill people of another religion, that is clear that they're able to do that through a propagation of media. It is not as though the heads of ISIS just cut them out and don't tell them the reason that they're doing it. That was largely unresponded to from opening government. The only thing they do is to reassert their case. They tell you, no, the problem is at the moment is that it's just people who just did trains and just like active guards of prisons. It is not the case that Nazi Germany is equivalent to all the cases that we talk about now, panel. We think it is pretty obvious that people actively committed these crimes. That's to say, we know that people in Sudan actively went out to kill the people and rape children and women in Darfur. There was an initiative to do that because they wanted to eliminate people another ethnicity. Similarly though, we say when ISIS goes out to actively destroy communities and to bomb areas, they know they are doing that because they want to push Islam onto another group. Thirdly though, you also know as a Hutu, you actively try to go to eliminate a group. There is no complicity for just not knowing the reason or the end point of a crime. That means banality is not applicable. OT also tells you that these atrocities are just individuals, therefore it's not applicable. Oscar responds to you to saying that in order for a genocide to ever take place, there must be individual murder at the baseline. No response from government. Government also says, I think this is the most horrific point, they are unable to opt out of these things. So Hutus were unable to opt out of killing Tutsis. Panel, Hutus literally drove down the street shouting, Tutsis are scum, and shooting everyone they could find. That is not something you could not opt out of. It was very easy for Hutus to not do that, even despite the fact there were lots of Hutus who helped Tutsis and helped them get escape. That is evidence that you could opt out of this. What does this mean? This means the sort of cases we're talking about are not worlds that you live on government. It's things like Rwanda, it's things like Sudan, and things like non-state actors like ISIS. This is important because it means the sort of narrative they want to push is probably not very believable in and of itself, but also requires a massive shifting of the truth in order for people to actually believe it. That's incredibly harmful. Let's talk about why we're far more likely to get community progress under our side. Because opening government says it's really difficult to grasp when you know your family, for example, could have been racist and you have to antagonize them. Panel, I tell you the most best way to convince people that racism is pervasive is the point at which they recognize their brother went out to kill a bunch of people and was probably a racist individual. The point at which you say, oh no, my family could never do that, you believe that no one could ever do that. When someone close to you, you have to antagonize them, and you know they are evil, that's the point that you realize that something is wrong. But on top of that, in a world in which you don't accept that, the people who have the social and political capital, like OG recognizes, are far more likely then to commit it again, because they don't think what they did in the past was wrong or there was a problem with it. They then tell us that it's better to get things like school teaching. I don't know what sort of school classes they'd ever tell you in kids, right? It would be something like, hey, please don't commit this. And then kids like, why did this happen? And they're like, oh, it just happened. Sorry. That's obviously not a convincing thing, right? We think it's right obvious when a kid goes, why did this happen? And you go, because people are racist and they judge people on the color of their skin and their religion. It is important, child, that you never do this again. That's a far more convincing narrative to push to your kids. Open government then says, but it's better when you blame the system because you're far more likely to get change. The problem with this is it allows countries to artificially differentiate, and states to artificially differentiate their system. That means, for example, in Japan, where they just changed their name, they got rid of the thing and they just ignored the actual problems. That's the reason that they're still racist to Korea and countries. I'll take closing.
Yeah, so this motion is about evil committed within bureaucracies. Can you explain what bureaucracy ISIS or anarchist Rwanda had?
Okay, given that their case entirely focused on Rwanda, it's probably a bit of a knife to say that this debate is not about Rwanda. Closing. But even in the case in which you ignore ISIS, we think all examples about Sudan and Rwanda apply. If it is the case that you say neither of those, I have no idea what the hell your case is besides Nazi Germany. Let's go back then to why we actually get community progress. We tell you that when you artificially change the system, like happened in Japan, you get the same problems happening again because you don't address the root of the problem that is often racism or often discrimination. We say then, panel, and this is crucial, you cannot have racism and banality of evil coexisting because racism in its nature is evil. It is horrific and it is a problem. That means inside government you always shift the blame because you don't see it as the problem. That means you're never ever likely to get things like the lack of identity on Rwandan citizen cards that recognise the only way to fix it is to actually target the key issue. Because recognise, panel, underside government, it is still the case that these atrocities are fueled by racism or are fueled by religion. But on their side, they don't recognise that. They don't identify that and they don't take structural changes to fix that in the future. We think at the point at which you know why something happened, why your brother killed someone down the street, why your mother was murdered because she had a different skin colour, that is the point at which time you as a community and you as a state can take active measures to stop it ever happening again. For that reason, side with OO.
I thank that speaker very much and also because in the top half and welcome the member of government to
Ready? We think that the narrative of opposition prevents reconciliation, reduces redress, and reduces the ever-watchful vigilance needed to reduce the likelihood of these horrors ever occurring again in the future. Two arguments. Firstly, why you reduce redress and vigilance on opposite side of the house, and secondly, why you harm reconciliation. Before that, I want to highlight two things about the top half. Firstly, I think it focuses too much on the truth of this narrative rather than the beneficial outcomes that stem as a result from this narrative. And if opening opposition is right and highlight these certain cases in which there is no structure, then that narrative is completely irrelevant in those circumstances, unless that is not where the debate is most likely to take place. One extraneous point of rebuttal to what Geneva says about people saying that we're just taking orders. I'm actually going to flip this and show why our narrative best deals with those circumstances. Because people will still believe that there are certain people in the system who are just taking orders and were not inherently evil, that they existed in a structure, that they didn't harbor a hard heart. People are still going to see that, and that narrative is not just going to be suddenly defeated on their side of the house. The question is then how you deal with those people. What we would say is that you deal with those people by saying, I know you existed in a system, and you were not personally evil, but your complicity in working with it led to that evil happening nevertheless, and you are still responsible nevertheless, not targeting a specific malice that we say that is within you, but saying that your agency and complicity in just going along with it is what is bad and responsible. So firstly, why is this narrative better able to lead to redress and reconciliation? I want to start with why this narrative is most likely to be bought into by people, whereas it isn't in their world. I want to highlight three things about the nature of evil in the public discourse that's important for this debate. Firstly, evil too often cloaks itself in good, in patriotism, in loyalty, in things that people do not immediately clue in is something that is bad and something that should be opposed. This means that it is very difficult to immediately see malice in an individual. Secondly, I think evil, because of how we all conceive it, because of the kind of media diets that we consume and the narratives of myths and stories, is often something that is extreme, something that's really hard to ground in the context of the real world. And this means that it's just equally hard for people to really think that an actual person in existence is evil. The third thing, and this is really important, no one self-identifies as evil. No one thinks themselves that they are evil, that they are horrible. Everyone thinks that they are doing something good and furthering a good project, or at least that they're relatively justified in what they're doing. So no one is going to self-identify with the narrative of opening opposition, where they're far more willing to self-identify with our narrative, which is that they're not personally evil, but they did something evil as a result of the system. What is the effect of this? Firstly, I would like to argue that it is less appealing to members of the offending group. And this is where we beat opening opposition. Because opening opposition focuses on the offenders themselves, but I don't think that's the most important thing. I think the important thing is the members of the offending group who are not themselves the ones committing the genocide. The Hutus in Rwanda who didn't pick up the machetes to kill the Tutsis. These people are more likely to buy into the narrative on our side of the house. Why is this the case? Firstly, it's just harder to believe a narrative of extreme evil for the reasons that I have identified. Secondly, it is actively alienating to say that there was something about your group that was just so intrinsically evil that means people are less likely to buy into this particular kind of narrative. On our side, we reduce the cost of acceptance. You are not personally evil, or your group is not personally evil, if you buy into our narrative, where that is the necessity of what opposition needs to get these people to believe. But this doesn't just apply to people in broad society, but it occurs to the most important people, the people who are existing in the system, the people who have the actual power to prevent things going forward into the future, to implement changes to prevent these things from occurring again. Hong Kong civil servants who have the power to resist the Chinese encroachment, local government officials in Uyghur-held China who are currently facilitating that oppression, the treatment of Roma people across the entirety of Eastern Europe. Those in positions of power have the ability to change how these people are treated. And being able to get them to buy into the fact that oppression is occurring and that reforms are needed is more likely to occur when there's a lower cost of accepting that particular narrative and when it's not a direct attack on them as people and their own intrinsic morality. What's the effect of this? Firstly, it leads to increased self-awareness, increased awareness of that society, and vigilance as to what needs to change and what can happen in the future. Knowing the road that leads to horror is far more likely to occur when the narrative of these communities is far more able to catch hold. This just means you are less likely to slip into those absolutely horrible situations. And I want to highlight as well, just because people don't think they're evil, you can still make them feel guilty when they believe that they have facilitated evil because of an action in a bureaucratic structure. So getting them to buy into our narrative means that they will have a guilt motivation for action, whereas on their side, if they never buy into the narrative in the first instance, they are just less likely to implement any of those changes. Thus, you do not get the ever-watchful vigilance needed to prevent horror. Thus, we beat off. The next is that we harm the ability for reconciliation between victims and victimizers. I think that too often, after horror has occurred, the tensions between these communities do not disappear, and that it's far more likely on opposition side of the house. Why is this the case? Two reasons. Firstly, you are directly saying that the victimizing group is evil. This is alienating, angering, and not going to make that group particularly like you as a result. This means that you just foster further division between these two communities. And secondly, it is harder for the victimizing group to feel like they are comfortable, or the victim group, to feel like they are comfortable reaching out and ever working with the victimizer again in the future, to the point at which you say everyone there is actively evil. Closing.
Yeah, this debate is about the narrative of the victims. We don't get what do you think the comparative is regarding the narrative of the offenders.
Yeah, no, we do care because the narrative of the victim is what we want the offenders to believe, and that's what our entire case has been. Particularly on that point, when you are a victim group and you need to forgive and reconcile, because you're not just going to be able to never have to interact with these people again, you need to be able to have the grounds for that forgiveness and reconciliation to occur. And if you believe that that group is evil, rather than just a structure that can be changed, you're less likely to be willing to work with that group going forward through into the future. And this not just means that you're less likely to get change, or that there's going to be more animosity, but it also just means that these people are less likely to feel safe. That in a post-conflict situation, they're more likely to be in a state of constant fear. And given that these people have just been through horror, being able to provide them some degree of sense of security, of safety, that once some reforms to the system has occurred, that they're not going to be brutalized again in the future, is a benefit of this narrative to these individuals. Proud to propose.
I think that speaker very much welcome the member of opposition.
Most of the group in this debate are talking about history in a very strange way. It's like there's atrocities, and then one day they just stop, and everything stays the same. The power structure, the people, all of them are just the same, and we just stop. This is not how it usually works. There's usually a big war and a big power change that change reality. What are we talking about? We're talking about new country forming, like Israel, like the Yugoslavian countries. We're talking about a revolution, like in South Africa, like in Korea, that threw away Japan. It means that in most of the cases, those communities are not in touch every day. The new communities are forming their own countries, are getting their own power. So that the most important question is, what kind of country, what kind of power are they forming? Okay. So my point will be, well, it is more likely that the people who suffer atrocities won't do new atrocities to other people around the world. Secondly, well, it's less likely that new conflicts will arrive between neighboring countries. And thirdly, about reparations. So, but first, couple points of rebuttal, okay? Because CG is a bit confused, okay? This motion is about the people that atrocity happened to them, not to the people who did them. It means that his analysis about why people are not going to believe that because nobody wants to think about them as evil is happening anyway. It's just not his motion. Specifically, the people that atrocity happened to them when they saw a Nazi officer shooting their brother and then laughing, they believe that there is something like evil. They are a lot more perceptive to this kind of message, and they will look for it in their own countries and do it. And then they tell us, but look, it's a lot harder, those countries are going to hate each other now because one group thinks that the other is evil. Look, first of all, what about the part that they had atrocities, okay, that people died, that they ruined their life and their family? There's a lot of other reasons for the group to hate each other. And secondly, we think that a lot of the times it is better to just separate them. A lot of the time just living in different neighborhoods, in different cities, in different countries will actually make less possibility of fight. And we think that it is a good thing that they won't have to live together if it will make the separation great. Okay, so let's talk about the new countries, because as we told you, in a lot of other cases, the people who got the atrocity happened to them, forming a new community or new power and their power of their own. But the problem, like in every country, it's very hard for people to criticize the state. Why? Because it's defined them. It's their identity. It's who they are. It's the flag that they love, the people that they feel a part, the state, and their memories. Okay, specifically, people the atrocity happened to them, the community and the state is even stronger, okay, because this is their safe haven. The Jews feel that Israel is them. A lot of them will die first before letting anything happen to the country. Why is that so bad? Because a lot of the times it's made very hard for them to actually criticize their own state. It means that even if the army might hurt minorities in the new place they live in, or in the group that used to be the atrocities, it's a lot harder to do it. If politicians have a rhetoric against them, it's a lot harder for criticizing. What is the difference and the delta in this debate, okay? When you're saying the banality of evil, that the problem is not, it can't be in a specific person, that not that something in evil, but an evil thing happen in an evil system, in a system that makes people do bad things. The criticize is specifically on the state or on the system that you are part of. When you are saying that people are evil, you can say that the system is good. You should support it, you should feel partly a part of it, but there are specific places, specific people, specific groups that you should change, that you should put out, that you should go against in order to save your own system, okay? We think that this is important because it's extremely effective. Because when people in Israel criticize the army and say this is a system that causes atrocities, there's a lot of people who think that this is an illegitimate criticism. They feel that this army is a good system. You can't say that it makes those atrocities. They feel personally attacked. But when you're saying there are soldiers or there are officers who are evil and are using our good system in order to hurt other people, this kind of criticism is extremely effective, and they are doing changes for that. And not only on specific people, we think that it actually has to do systematic changes. This is why in the Israeli army you have an apparently illegal command, because you know that even though you can believe in the system and believe in the army, those people can misuse it in order for their own gains, because there are people who are evil. We think that this is help changing rules. This is how to put checks and balances on politicians and on officers. We think this is what stops the next revolution. And we think that this is a very common state. As we told you, in Serbia and Croatia, the same thing happened in Korea, the same happened in South Africa, the Tutsis in Rwanda. We think that those people need to form their own state and a new community with less option of new atrocities, because making sure that the next person is not going to be a part of this system, not be a part of this atrocity, is the most important thing that we can do, specifically as people who Secondly, let's talk about new conflicts, but first, can I get...
Yeah. So, even if some perpetrators were racist and evil, in the future we get least racism and evil when those in power from the perpetrating group agree to recognize what happened to you, or as CG rewarded or benefits redress and reconciliation. This is true whether that is within or between countries. Please engage.
Thank you. I didn't understand that, I'm sorry. Okay, look, let's talk about new conflicts. I hope you got it. A lot of the people from the people who has been who got hurt in the situation are not going to get that this message that there is no evil in the world and it's only a system. Why? Because they saw evil in their eyes. Why? Because they saw their family member being killed by specific people who did a lot more than they were actually told them to do. We talked about the Moshetas in the Hutu and the Tutsis. There's a lot of examples in the Holocaust. People don't believe it. The problem is when your community, okay, tells you something that you cannot believe in, that you think that this is wrong, that they can't really solve it, the possibility of people taking the action to their own hand. I am the only one who understands that there is evil in the world, and I have to do something about it. Then the possibility of them grouping up and taking action to actually hurt the group who hurts them is a lot greater. This is why we think that it could have happened. We think that it happened in the Hutu and the Tutsi. Do you think that the Balkan war will be a lot longer? We think the possibility that European the Jews in Poland would just take the things to their own hand and decide to kill people because the system will never help them and never listen to them is a lot greater. We think that there's, in the alternative, people feel that at least the community cares about them. People understand that there's a problem. The community usually has a lot more responsibility and understand that the new conflict is not in their interest. We think that people should feel a part of their own community, feel safe, feel that they don't need to save the world in order for new conflict not to begin. Because of all of those reasons, please oppose. Thank you very much.
I thank that speaker very much. Welcome government with.
We are more likely to recognize, to forgive, and to move past when we see that evil is something that stems out of our individual weaknesses, as opposed to being born with it, as opposed to being tied to your religion or your skin color or any other intrinsic belief or any other intrinsic part of yourselves. What we're going to do in closing government is show you, I'm going to be doing three things in this speech. First one is to go through Trenton's arguments, first off, on preventing occurrence and reoccurrence, and secondly on reconciliation, and showing you why the analysis given was unique and why it is the most important thing for the Gov bench. Second of all, I'll be rebutting the closing opposition case, and lastly, showing you why these strategic weaknesses in opening opposition mean they cannot take this debate. So let's start with occurrence and reoccurrence, Trenton's first argument. What we claim to uniquely from closing government was that we have a mechanism to prevent and to lessen the chance of evil from perpetuating and being spread within bureaucracies. The analysis goes like this. One, that individuals don't ever like accepting they are evil. The reason for this is very simple, right? People individually don't like to believe that they are evil. I think it is very simple, simply put, that human beings see things through their own lenses and through their own eyes, and are therefore likely to justify all the actions that they commit. What happens then is they're committed to a logic trap on their side of the house. What happens on their side of the house is they say, only evil people can commit evil things. Only people who are intrinsically evil can commit acts of evil. I am not evil. Therefore, what I am doing, regardless of what it might be, can never be evil. I think that is the biggest problem with the opposition bench and with the view that evil is intrinsic, is that individuals who might be committing actions of evil, supporting and perpetuating those beliefs because they believe they themselves are not evil, therefore don't recognize that evil is being committed. What are the impacts of this, and why does our side of the house change this? One, we prevent reoccurrence because individuals are more likely to be vigilant. People within the system who are most capable of resisting, like these civil servants in the case of Hong Kong, resisting what the Hong Kong government is doing. They are in a prime position of power to be able to take action, and we think having them recognize that they themselves might not be evil, their colleagues might not be evil, what they might be doing is evil, and separating out those two things and recognizing their own ambition, which we think is of human nature, means they're more capable of taking action before it is too late. But second of all, prevents the reoccurrence because we can criticize bureaucracies and what they do as opposed to needing to attack those individuals. We think this is the most important thing in the debate because it weighs out everything else. We can prevent these bad things from actually occurring in the first place, and I think that's a win. Our second argument was about reconciliation. No, thank you. The key analysis was this. After the system is dismantled, after bureaucracy and the evil and the atrocities are over, individuals who might have committed acts of evil are no longer capable of committing that act of evil because the system that perpetuated their greed and ambition no longer exists. This is the most important mechanism in recognizing how reconciliation takes place. What are the impacts of this? One, it reduces internal conflict because you are less likely, as a scared victim of previous crime, to lash out against those communities who might have committed crimes previously, because you do so if you recognize they're inherently evil. But if you recognize that they no longer have these systems through which their greed and ambition can drive themselves, you are less likely to be scared and therefore take violent action. This improves reconciliation within the state. But second of all, on the international stage as well, I think recognizing that a lot of people in the bureaucracies, for instance, of the Yugoslav states who committed those acts of evil because of the system of the state, recognizing that those are not individual inherent evil of themselves, and now that the state is gone, now that Milosevic's government is gone, being able to forgive them for what they've done, not necessarily forgive, but not to be scared of further reprisals because they're inherently evil, is something that helps international reconciliation, and that I think leads to more peace and stability. Let's respond to the closing opposition case. Before that, yeah.
Despite this very interesting case shift, we tell you in OO, and CO kindly retells you, the banality of evil removes the ability to identify and the incentives that are
Sure, I'll respond to this in your case. I'll respond to this in your case.
And causes atrocities.
No, it's my stage. I'll respond to this later, and second of all, it's not a reframing. Trenton says all of this. Okay, closing opposition. I think there are several things here. The first thing they say is it's not about how, it should be about how the victims see it, not how the leaders see it. I think if we can prove that the leaders see it and are therefore less likely to commit in the future, that's a win for us. I don't see why it must always be about the victims, right? The second thing they try to say is it's hard to criticize the state and it's better and easier to criticize individuals and therefore it's easier to take action against individuals, right? Number one, we think it is easy and easier on our side to separate the state from the individuals, right? Because you recognize you recognize the state as a problem, obviously. We also recognize the motives of individuals within there. So I don't see how that necessarily is different on either side. Second of all, I think very often individuals within the state recognizing evil is probably more significant to them than some notion of patriotism, right? But I think recognizing that you are hurting an individual human, that you are committing a moral atrocity against someone is more strong, it's a stronger push towards you not doing those things than some love of patriotism. Like they assert to you entirely that love for the state somehow trumps ability to criticize what the state might be doing. I just think that is blatantly untrue. But third of all, right? I just don't see how anything changes on their side of the house, because it becomes very easy for the state to then say, to scapegoat individuals and say, look, these acts of evil weren't committed by the state or weren't facilitated by the way the structure of the bureaucracy happened, but rather it's just individuals who are rotten apples within the state, who are inherently evil, who committed a lot of these things, right? I think that is the point at which it becomes easiest for the state to escape the sort of criticism by simply levying all the blame on these individual evil people, rather than looking at themselves and saying, actually, maybe it's the bureaucracy we've set up that facilitates this evil. The last thing they try to tell you is people lash out because they feel insufficient, and they lash out towards the communities, which prevents reconciliation. Number one, we think it's worse to foment hate, because the number one reason why people lash out after periods of conflict is because they're scared. They're scared that there are individuals who are inherently evil, who are out to get them, and they need to take action before they are further hurt. I think when you can recognize that those people no longer are a threat, as I explained, you are less likely to lash out. But second of all, right, the point is here, everyone believes it, right? The only way that the CO extension runs is if they somehow, individuals believe that this is an insufficient explanation for evil. But the point of the Gov Bench is we believe a world where everyone should believe this is the explanation for evil. So I'm not sure what the logical reason for that argument standing is. That's not what the opening opposition thinks. They question what this debate is about. I think everyone here is very clear for all the other teams. This is about bureaucratic systems. It's about, for instance, in China. Do you blame individual evil people within the bureaucracy for locking up the Uyghurs, or do you recognize that they're only trying to climb the ladder? I think you need to recognize there is some bureaucracy. Yes, obviously there are individuals who commit great acts of evil without a bureaucracy, right? Like you can go and slaughter, all the Tutsis because you're inherently evil or you're fighting for survival, but this debate is about bureaucracy specifically. Second of all, they say the legal threshold for prosecutions disappears. I think this is not true, because we're still recognizing that the acts they're committing are evil, right? It's just the question of where the evil comes from, whether or not they're inherently evil, whether they were driven by desire, by greed, by ambition. We punish people for committing evil acts through greed and ambition. So I'm not sure why the legal threshold changes. And even if it decreases to some extent, I'm not sure why that outweighs all the benefits we do, because we still put them in prison. Thirdly, they say individuals don't accept the evil of actions. This is just not true, because you have to recognize the actions are evil before this debate happens in the first place. The reason that Japanese still go to the Yasukuni shrine is because they don't think what was committed was evil in the first place, right? What needs to be done here, this debate only is relevant when you recognize that evil has been committed. The question is where it comes from, where its origins are, and we think it's much better to go with government. Very proud to report.
I thank that speaker very much.
Most of the times, being part of a group that was perpetrated against like a huge atrocity is a bad thing to be. But luckily for us, in debates of this sort, we think we are the only one who really understands what's going on. Firstly, I'm going to talk about what are the likely scenarios, why a lot of what we heard from most of the groups is just irrelevant for what this debate is about. Secondly, I'm going to talk about where do we get more conflicts and why this is incredibly important, why the fact that we didn't get enough responses from CG on this wins the debate over them like immediately. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about how those communities are going to be formed, why this is going to be much better on our side, also responding to a lot of what we heard on government side. Let's begin. So first, let's talk about what opening have talked about. Because most of their bottom lines, although they had many analysis like points, talked about where do we get better like interdependence between those communities? Where do they teach in schools those things? Where do the racial tensions become higher or lower on those things? This is the bottom lines of the important thing that many of them talks about. We think that this characterization is just false in the vast majority of those cases. Why is that? Because we say that first of all, if the stronger country could have just continued to do those things, it would have done those things. That would have meant that the Holocaust wouldn't have ended. The fact that it has ended meant that something significant has changed under their side of the house. And we think that most of those things means that the people who were offended ran away to other places or created their own countries. In many cases, the offender countries got to their place and then did those things. How can we see that? Because those are the examples that even they talked about. This is what happens when we talked about Israel and German Nazis. This is what happened when we talked about Japan and Korea. Even with the case of the Hutu and Tutsis, we think that the Hutus ran to a different countries and the Tutsi have Rwanda right now. Those are the things that happens in the vast majority of those cases. So the communities are different and most of those cases are irrelevant. Now let's talk about CG. Because we think that CG is also missing out a lot of the debate. They talk about the narrative of the perpetrators, but what they say, they don't think that they will be convinced that they are evil. We think that that might be fair in some cases, but the question is, what's the comparative? We think that first of all, they didn't give us any analysis on why the fact that the victims think something A means that the perpetrator will think the same thing. How did the victim convince those people? But we think that also, in many of those cases, the perpetrators already think that they have done bad things because of the analysis I gave you, because they've lost the war, because this is what we see they are being put upon by the countries that are now controlling them. We don't think that specifically the people that are probably racist against and hate, telling them that your country was wrong, is going to change their mind, and all of CG's case is based on that specific promise. This is what they're losing. Let's talk about where do we get more conflicts. Because opening governments and then closing governments again says those people, like the perpetrators, won't accept the fact that they're evil, therefore there is going to be more conflict. So I already addressed that, like we don't think that like this is the likely scenario that like they will think that they're evil and therefore more conflict is happening, but we don't think why this is the main obstacle for peace, or why even close peace is the most important thing in this debate. And this is what their case is hinged on. Because we say that first of all, there are obviously other obstacles, like the fact that you were done like atrocities by the other side. That means that there are probably like tensions that you want to have close relations, but we don't think that close relations are good. We think it creates more tensions, it creates more people close to each other, it creates the extreme thing that you are cooperating with the other side. We don't think that they are showing us why it's good. Then CG tells us, but if you think that if the victims think that those people are evil, they will attack them more. So first of all, they are not responding to Amichai's case, saying that the people who are likely to attack more are probably the extremists already, and there are many of those people, like probably all of them, already don't believe what the governments are telling them. Because governments assume that this is going to be the only narrative without ever analyzing why this narrative is effective on many people in those communities. But Amichai gave you the other side of this. He told you that many of those people literally saw some soldiers shooting their child, literally saw people raping their wife. We think that those people won't accept that it's just a system because they have seen evil within their eyes. And then the comparative is where do we get those people to act less? Again, something that we have analyzed and didn't get a response to. What we tell you? We tell you that first of all, when they don't get addressed by the government, they think that they need to act because no one else showed their anger on the evil people that have done those acts. This is what is creating them to act more, and then probably killing other people within a country where conflict was creates more tensions. We've seen this over and over again. This is actually what is creating new wars to emerge, as we have seen in the Balkans like through the years. But secondly, we think that on the other side of the house, the community is going to lower those things. CG claims that the entire community will go against the perpetrators. We don't think this is the likely scenario for a community that was being done atrocity on, or like a non-ESL way to say that. We think that they are weak. We think that they want to build themselves from the get-go. We think that probably what they're going to say is, yes, those people were evil, but now we are moving forward to build our own communities. And that means that then when extremists hear this message, they are much more likely to follow it because it is closer to what they are already thinking, which means that the likelihood of more chances of conflict and war emerging is much greater on their side of the house. We think this by itself also wins this debate. Before I move on, I will take first, okay.
When you form a new state for victims, the banality of evil does not target your own government, but goodwill by the offending state is still important. South Korea was massively harmed by Japan blocking mineral imports just recently. Please engage.
We don't think that, I truly don't get the logic of what you're saying. We think that the banality of evil is like the narrative that is controlling how you see evil within those countries. We think it does affect what Amichai told you. We think that the relation between those countries is not changing because Japan is not going to believe Korea in any side of the house, and we didn't analyze that. Let's talk about how the country is being built. Because CG tells you that now the bureaucrats will just simply understand that they are wrong. We think that there is no analysis on why it is the case, why they're going to buy this message so heavily, but we've given you the other side of it. We've told you that specifically in those places, people really think that the new country has saved them. They really like this country. They are not willing to buy that the country that they are saving is doing wrong. It is more important even that we told you that they are connecting the specific thing that they are trying to talk about to the entire system. You're not saying that this act is wrong, but that the entire system is wrong, and the system can't be wrong, it has to be good. Which means the change is much less likely on their side of the house. But on our side of the house, we do get effective criticism, because it is likely that people who are doing bad things will be criticized. They're saying that we don't get systemic change. What we say is that when we condemn specific politicians who are trying to do bad things, they will prevent the bad systemic change from happening. When we condemn again and again the orders that are being given by some parts of the military, we are getting the systemic change because we say that those orders are illegal and shouldn't be done. We say that because this criticism is much more effective, we're creating much more change and checks and balances on our side of the house. Please oppose the motion. Thank you.
Stuff, guys.
Thank you very much.